by registering my personal appreciation to the conference organizers, ICJ Kenya chapter, for the invitation to be here this morning, and for the warm welcome accorded me since my arrival in Mombasa yesterday. It's a great honor to be here. And secondly, let me also acknowledge the previous speaker, Honorable Isaac Hassan, the current chairperson of Independent Police Oversight Authority, and the former IEBC chair, who is himself an accomplished public servant and jurist Kenya can be truly proud of. It's an honor to share this platform with you, sir, this morning. And I also stand in the presence of many distinguished citizens of Kenya and Africa, who I cannot name one by one to avoid the embarrassment of leaving out somebody else I should have recognized. So I'll stand on the protocols that Eric has already established and say once again, good morning. Allow me at the outset to state that my ambition this morning is quite modest. It is simply to share some personal reflections around the area of focus which has been ascribed to me as protecting democratic futures and reclaiming the rule of law. Protecting democratic futures and reclaiming the rule of law. Now, as a background to the conversation, we have already heard that there has been consistent decline in democracy worldwide for 6 years up until 2022. And more concerning is the growth and entrenchment of 91 autocracies, which now outnumber democracies by 3 for the first time in over 2 decades. So the statistics reflect citizens' protests and declining democratic confidence as the citizens see no relief, reprieve, or justice in a political system that seems to continuously alienate and mock them. And we've already heard about Kenya and the suggestion that Kenya has become a compelling case study of democratic backsliding, cloaked in the regularity of elections and constitutional formalism without constitutional substance, as it were. And we've heard about Kenya's dark patch, which includes the abduction and torture, among others, of protesters, as well as the blatant disregard for judicial oversight in that state security agencies have shown open defiance of court directives, which is a reflection of a culture of impunity and a systematic hollowing out of the rule of law. Now, the main pivot of my conversation is a famous quote I'm sure we're all familiar with from an American constitutionalist called James Madison, who was one of the founding fathers of the American constitutional experiment. And I want to quote extensively part of his writing. The famous part is the short part, but I think there's a bigger context I would like to capture. And he says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And that's the famous part, but I think it goes on to explain a little. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. This is James Madison continuing. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on government. And in our context, I think this is why we have regular elections, because the people have to give the government authority to govern them. And it goes on to say, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civilized society. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained. End of quote. So the conception of government that Madison brings forward is the idea that governments are there to deliver justice. And in this context, not justice as a judicial concept, but justice as a moral value. You know, the whole essence of dignity and equality and opportunity, a principle which far goes beyond the formalism of the judicial process, which is one of the things I think we're trying to grapple with in this context, where we're saying you can have a legal process that confers formal authority on a group of people to exercise government authority, but those people can actually obtain that power in a manner that does not have genuine legitimacy. Now, in my observation, I would like to disagree a little with the profound wisdom of James Madison about the nature of government and the democratic imperative for the rule of law and limited government. One of the false assumptions behind this statement is the assumption that angels are immune to the corrupting influence of power. So that's why it says if men were angels, then you need no government. But anyone familiar with the biblical narrative cannot be faithful to the story of the corrupting influence of power if one failed to acknowledge that even the angel Lucifer, when motivated by selfish ambition, failed to manage the authority which his creator had entrusted to him to administer. And I think a sober consideration of political power and democratic governance must fully account for this reality that power is corrupting. And when you give people power, the tendency is to appropriate that power for less noble purposes than what they professed when they were trying to get that power. The point I'm trying to emphasize there is that power is so corrupting that even angels have been known to be corrupted by power. And you cannot talk about politics and governance with a naive assumption that somehow you're going to create systems that are going to do away with that reality. Because that's a reality of power. It has got an immense capacity for corrupting. And so we should not be so easily disillusioned when people with power abuse it. We should constantly and vigilantly work to mitigate the risk of such a phenomenon manifesting in our governance systems. We should never underestimate the danger of power being a corrupting influence, and we should also never underestimate the propensity of mankind to being corrupted by the experience of power. Now, when you come to the rule of law as a concept itself, I believe the rule of law is founded upon the fundamental principle. One of the most critical principles of the rule of law concept is the equality before the law. So, where the law is supposed to govern everybody, you are proceeding on the assumption that there is nobody in that society who is above the law. Whether it is the president, his family, his partners in politics, everybody must be judged by the law. And that requires some radical thought process in our African culture, because we're a people who are given to, we want somebody to be bigger than, and we have a political culture where we have big men. You know, the big man becomes a big man at the clan level, at the tribal level, at the political level, then he moves on to the national level. And we believe somehow that those people are going to be governed by different values than the rest of us. But in a rule of law context, nobody is above the law. Everybody is supposed to be equal before the law. And I'm reminded of an experience I had as a very young magistrate. There was a case involving the former Speaker of Parliament, who had also served as a former Minister of Education, and there were allegations of corruption in the procurement of learning materials. The government had just introduced free primary education at the introduction of multi-party politics in our country, and a lot of resources were diverted. I think it was over 20% of the annual budget of the Ministry of Education, which had been siphoned off in a process that involved the former president himself. Actually, he was a sitting president at the time. So there was a signature that had to be investigated. The issue was this signature put there by the president or somebody else? And obviously the defense made a simple request to the court to say, the president is the best person who can answer this question. At which point the DPP said, no, your worship, you cannot do that. I'm like, well, it's your case. Unless you're withdrawing it, I think we are a court seeking after truth. And then they said, no, the president cannot come to magistrate courts. We must meet at the office of the president and cabinet. And at which point my Chief Justice, I had already made the order to say, no, courts convene at court premises. All right, so my Chief Justice at that point called me up and said, I'm behind you, don't allow anybody to bully you. If the president has to come as a witness, let him come to your court. And eventually he had to come in court. And I remember at the end of his testimony, then the DPP again was applying that the president should leave the court before the magistrate, which is against our court protocol. I said, no, it's my court. I am done, I'll leave. But that experience, I remember receiving phone calls from the IG of police and other people trying to threaten me in different ways. And for me, what baffled me, and maybe I was a bit naive, but what baffled me was the whole concept of the equality before the law. How everybody wanted us to bend the rules, as it were, when we are told, when we take our judicial oath, is that we'll do justice without fear or favor, affection or ill will. So for me, that really at any point in my career really reinforced the need to rise above what I call the culture of hypocrisy. I think people are very hypocritical about democracy, and I think democracy thrives on truth and integrity. And where you have a culture that does not value integrity and truth, it is very difficult to actually have an effective rule of law experience. So beyond the issue of rule of law, I think at a very basic level, democracy itself is premised upon one of the key tenets of democracy is the sacred notion of one man or one woman, one vote. Okay? So democracy is an expression of the dignity and value, and it's not even a legal principle, it's a moral value that any society that wants to operate on justice must value every individual equally. Okay? So irrespective of your social status, irrespective of your how rich or poor you are, irrespective of whether you're educated or not, when it comes to who is going to exercise government over you, all of us must have the same voice. So one person will have one vote. And that's why we should never lose interest in making sure that electoral processes work effectively. We're talking about our neighbors in Tanzania. I come from Malawi. You will never have peace and so-called law and order, as we are told by those who want to manipulate the process, in a context where you have grievance and disillusionment. Because people know when they are not being given a fair service. People know when politicians are being corrupt. And democracy has provided an avenue for them to have a say by casting a vote. So you're saying every so often, on a regular basis, you'll have a chance to tell us who you want to govern you. Now, if that process is itself manipulated, as we have seen with our friends in Tanzania, then violence will be the final outcome. Because ultimately what people are looking for is justice. They want to ensure that their interests are adequately represented. So democracy thrives when that electoral process of one man or one woman, one vote is adequately guaranteed. And democratic governance itself proceeds from the assumption that the power to govern derives from the governed. Okay, so the boss is not the politician. The boss is the citizen. And democratic elections become the mechanism by which the governed choose their government. All right, so conceptually, that is the principle that democratic governance is supposed to operate from. That it is my autonomy as an individual to choose who is going to be my president. You can't impose that on me. And even if the one I choose doesn't win the election, but at least I get to express my preference in a legitimate process. Now, insofar as democratic practice itself is concerned, there is a supply and demand dynamics in democracy. So, in my view, one might conceive of democracy as functioning on the basis of supply and demand dynamics. So society has to demand a certain caliber of leadership. Okay? So society must demand a certain caliber of leadership. But in order to generate such a social imperative, you need to have extensive civic engagement to clarify the role of government in allocating resources and distribution of opportunities for socio-economic development and social mobility. So, citizen participation in democratic processes is an important civic responsibility. You know, when people are so disinterested in participating in voting, it is one of the most, when you consider that people have given their lives for us to obtain this right, I actually feel like it's one of the most irresponsible things to do, to say I'll never vote when you can vote. You know, because somehow you feel like the system doesn't work. The question should be, how can we make the system work? So there must be a demand placed on democracy. Now the supply side requires those who know, like us as jurists gathered here, to intentionally groom the type of citizens who can best respond to the civic need for transformational leadership. So we cannot demand better leadership when we are not raising better citizens. One unspoken axiom of democracy is that each society gets the leaders it deserves, because your leaders come from within your own ranks. It is quite hypocritical to raise children with ethnic prejudice in our homes, to put them through a formal education system predicated upon cheating, and expect that somehow from such a sample society will obtain leadership with a moral integrity and an inclusive mentality. All right, so the transformation we are craving, for me, is not purely a legal function. The law cannot create good citizens. It's a social responsibility beyond, because sometimes I think we place too much faith in the law, as if the law can magically produce for us leaders of a certain caliber. It takes more than the law. The law can be a very powerful organizing instrument, but society must play its part. Nelson Mandela's don't just happen on societies. They come through a process. So there is the democratic need to confront our prejudices. That's one issue, for the sake of time, that I would highlight. Society must embrace the right values to raise the right caliber of leadership. Or someone else must realize the responsibility to raise that kind of leadership and fill the gap. And in my humble opinion, professional bodies like ICJ Kenya can play a role in breaking down the prejudice pervasive in larger society by letting merit and not ethnicity determine how we administer professional affairs. I'm an African, I come from Malawi. I know the debilitating impact of ethnic politics on national development. I benefit from I don't know if it would resonate in Kenya. I benefit from having a surname that doesn't quite easily place me. Okay? You know what I'm talking about? Yes. So nobody can place me by hearing my surname alone. So they would always ask me, where do you come from? I always tell them, I'm coming from home. Okay? Because you can actually see it. They want to pigeonhole you. All right? What does that matter? You know? We cannot hope to protect democracy for the future if we don't confront the society iniquities that are inimical to a truly open society and accountable government which serves the interests of all, not only the ethnically dominant or the politically powerful. Like I'm saying, we must get rid of some of this hypocrisy. We want a government, or we want a leader that is all-embracing, when at every other level of society, we are not practicing that. When in our offices, we recruit based on ethnicity. And it doesn't have to be overt, but sometimes you actually know. You know, I remember speaking to the Bar Association in Johannesburg at some stage as a young judge. And they have a process in their jurisdiction where you can actually act as a judge in order for you to determine whether you really want that career. So there were many people who had done that job, but a lot of them said, I would never apply because I know I'll never be appointed. Because I come from the wrong race, so I come from the wrong tribe. You know, until we cultivate a culture of justice and fairness across all society, only then can we hope to secure our democratic heritage. Democracy happens within a social context. If the social context is not sound, it is quite unrealistic to expect a viable democracy. But also I should warn that there should be a measure of realism which should inform our endeavors. We should not create false expectations about the speed and depth of transformation through one electoral event. I was watching the speech by the mayor-elect accepting his victory, and I'm praying hard for him because he's given some very big promises. He's made some very big promises. I mean, I'm excited about his victory because it shows us what's possible in the current context, but he must also work hard to live up to that promise. Now, how does democracy work in practice, in my view? Just 3 or 4 steps that I have conceived that I think should inform our consideration. Democracy, in essence, based on the thoughts I shared earlier on, I believe depends on the agency of the voter, okay? The agency of the voter. In other words, the capacity of the citizen to exercise choice in a manner that aligns with his or her needs and interests. Okay, so democracy assumes that the voter will act with a rational choice in a manner that is reasonable. And in our elections in Malawi, we have seen this trend because the outgoing president who just lost the elections, their party, in terms of the demographics, they shouldn't have lost that election. Okay, demographically, they are the most dominant. But they miscalculated on their voter because the cost of living crisis does not respect your ethnic origins. Okay, if bread is going up, it's going up, whatever tribe you are. And you can actually see that the voters were exercising a very rational choice because even in their so-called strongholds, they chose the president for the opposition, but they still chose the MP for their party. Okay, so it wasn't a default choice. Voters were actually actively saying, Mr. President, we don't want you, but for our MP, we'll still keep our party. All right? That's how democracy is supposed to function. The voter has agency. Now, secondly, in order to exercise choice and effective agency, one needs access to sound information or correct information. Okay, so the whole issue of civic space matters because the capacity of the voter to exercise choice responsibly depends on the kind of information they have access to. So this therefore makes the marketplace of ideas a very vital element to democratic societies. Okay, democratic societies that suppress thought and ideas are actually shortchanging themselves. And so society vigilance is a democratic imperative to preserve the civic space that allows freedom to discuss issues and debate solutions to the myriad challenges that affect our communities. So every problem that we have, no one person has got enough wisdom to solve it. And where you have democratic openness, you are more likely to arrive at more just outcomes. So why does freedom of expression matter? The quality of democracy depends on the effectiveness of how services are delivered for the citizens. And the robustness of democratic discourse determines the quality and effectiveness of policy choices which are pursued to address different situations and challenges. So where you have more people, you know, in my language, we have a saying that says, Mutu mo tsusi zadenga, meaning one head cannot carry the roof, okay? You don't build a house on just one pole. You need several poles. And that's the whole concept of democracy. When ideas are suppressed through suppression of dissenting voices using whatever means, the society loses out since untested ideas carry the day in the place of the best ideas. Now, where you have autocratic regimes, the ideas of one man are supposed to carry the day. You know, so imagine in a nation of millions of people, somehow this one man assumes that he has the whole monopoly of wisdom for all your challenges. So the unlawful or illegal acts of holders of power are hidden from the public, hence disabling the power of the public to hold duty bearers to account. And so where you have poverty of ideas, that is a reflection of poverty of leadership. Okay? Good leaders are not threatened by the good ideas of others. Where leaders must feel that they must always have the final word, that is always a challenge. Now quickly, what would be some of the proposed solutions? Like I said, we need vigilance at all levels. The judiciary must be very vigilant. Recently we had a case in our jurisdiction where a social media commentator who had been arrested over and over again and beaten up so many times was actually facing a criminal charge because he had commented on an allegation of some fraudulent procurement at the armed forces, you know, and he was being accused of falsely maligning the army general and so on and so forth. And cleverly, his lawyers transformed that petition into a constitutional question to say, how does this sit in the context of a democratic culture where we're supposed to have openness and all these things? And the courts at that level upheld the petition and said, no. Just somebody writing on Facebook that Mr. So-and-so has been implicated in an irregular procurement, even if that is false, assuming he has defamed that person, then there are civil remedies. You don't need to bring the whole weight of the criminal law against that person. And quite interestingly, that judgment was delivered about a month or so before the elections. And that is one of the social commentators that has got a huge following, and a lot of his analysis were actually borne out. So you could see why the powers that be did not like his commentaries. You know, so there's need for vigilance against any encroachment on the civic space. But like I said, it is also important to empower youth not to despair, but to cultivate effective strategies for constructive civic participation instead of cynicism and rebellion. And again, the election in New York is a good testament to what, this is a 34-year-old young man, not even born in the US. He was born in Uganda, you know, and he has won an election, and Trump was against him, very clear, you know. So there is opportunity for change, but people must be empowered to how they can engage with that process. But I think we also need to learn from history. We must build systems and not personality cults which breed disillusionment, like you already said. You know, we must resist any attempt to create a whole movement just around a personality instead of creating strong institutions that can actually protect us from any abuse. We also need to cultivate a culture of ethical fidelity. You know, beyond technical proficiency, we must demand ethical compliance through professional bodies for lawyers, doctors, accountants, teachers, academics, journalists, architects. In other words, if we neglect enforcement of ethical standards at that level, we cannot expect men and women of right moral standing to simply fall from the sky. I think we shouldn't be disconnected in our quest to creating democracies that work. Democracies that work, they function within a context. And where, like I'm saying, where even at our professional level, we are not eager to enforce standards. We shouldn't expect people when they assume higher office to start doing that from nowhere. We must endeavor to entrench a culture of accountability early if we want to build a society that respects the rule of law. You know, we shouldn't ignore where people are breaching the law. A fish rots from the head. That's a Malawian proverb, you know? A fish rots from the head. And personally, I believe that as professional elites, we must learn to lead by a good example. You know, whether you like it or not, if you're sitting within this room, you're not the ordinary Kenyan. You don't represent the ordinary Kenyan. Or you don't represent the ordinary of whichever country you're coming from. You are part of a group of people who have had opportunities that have actually propelled you to where you are. And how you conduct your affairs at that level can become a model of whether you believe in the values you advocate or they're just things you say to make a living. And we need to create a culture where people recognize that leadership is a privilege and not a right. Leadership is a responsibility. You know, nobody has to vote for me to be a man. I'm a man. I've got rights as a man. But if she aspires to be your president, she can't do that by right. She must convince enough Kenyans to give her that vote. That's not a right. So when people assume that office, then they forget that. And they begin to treat the people who gave them that privilege as though they're the ones who should be sucking up to them. You know, we need to recognize that there's need for effective social stewardship so that when you are given that trust at whatever level, you can use it for the greater good of everybody. Like I said, dignity and opportunity are expressions of justice. You know, justice, like I said, it's not a legal concept but a moral value which encompasses the twin concepts of dignity. The idea that who is a person? And a person has value in and of himself or herself by virtue of just being a person, irrespective of their education or lack of it, whatever else they don't have, by virtue of being a person, they have value. And if you have a just society, then every person will have opportunity. The opportunity to attain his or her full potential. So, to participate in a process that creates structures of power, whose policies and decisions affect the ability one has to live with dignity, becomes a civic function to be exercised with utmost responsibility. And we need to ensure that the citizen does not get so disillusioned with this process of participating in democratic change so that they resort to more disruptive means of trying to influence things. As I get towards the end, some thoughts I would like to put across as we consider how we can protect our democratic futures. I think there's need for versatility in our response to emerging realities. First, a village which had for ages a traffic code to regulate the movement of a handful of ox carts needs to overhaul the entire system when, due to development, several households have acquired motor vehicles which are now plying the streets at different speeds to what everyone else was used to. The motor vehicle is still a mode of transportation, but its high speed demands a regulatory framework that mitigates the risks posed by the new technology. So, while the values of a democratic society, values like inclusion, openness, accountability, dignity, opportunity, remain unchanging, The rule of law framework in a digital space needs to adopt to provide effective safeguards against the potential for abuse which recent innovations impact our culture poses to the society at large. So for example, social media can facilitate what amounts to propaganda, and ensuring that balanced and accurate information and diversity of opinions are heard and given a platform should be one key focus area as we seek to reclaim the rule of law and protect democratic values. So there must be versatility and creativity to animate our efforts. And I would like to say this, that when we consider the formidable odds against which our founding fathers contended in order to secure political independence in the last century, it would be quite irresponsible to throw up our hands in surrender merely because the enemies of democracy appear so powerful. So yes, we know that the politicians and all those who want to pervert democracy for their benefit are very powerful. But the real issue becomes, how much does the ideal of just societies in which all people live with dignity matter to us, individually and collectively? How much does the dignity which we have been endowed with and our children have been endowed with, how much do those things matter to us? Are we going to just say, well, it seems like democracy is in recession and therefore nothing can be done about it? Or are we going to recognize that we have an opportunity? So how effectively are our current laws and legal processes adapted to ensure that digital technology and its immense potential to reach masses remains a force for good and not an instrument for some demagogue or other shrewd, power-hungry individual to capture the public mood of discontent to attain access to state power for nefarious purposes? We should not underestimate the potential for the digital space to influence the next political events. And I think we shouldn't think of politics in the conventional sense, where you hold a rally and people come together in person and so on. The society of today is moving at a different level. We heard from Cameroon that 65% of their population is under 25. So when you're thinking of how to protect democratic futures, don't think like you thought in 1990. They are operating in a different world altogether. So as the world around us keeps evolving, how responsive are we to those trends without diluting or losing sight of our core principles of justice? Like I said, dignity and opportunity. In closing, I would like to suggest that exclusion of others on the basis of prejudice of any kind deprives any society of its best talent. Opportunities are not shared equitably, and the excluded eventually run out of patience, and social disruption becomes inevitable. So where you have a society where certain people continually feel excluded, they will eventually resort to very disruptive remedies. So the rule of law can only flourish when we adopt a culture of making the law the instrument by which all administrative actions and political decisions at all levels of society are made. Like we said, digital technology has radically altered the sphere and speed of human interactions, and it's now much easier to create a sense of lack of accountability, which may foster lawlessness and breakdown of social cohesion through a common set of values. Jurists have to collaborate with technological innovators to come up with mechanisms that will ensure fairness and accuracy of information in the civic space. Remember, we have said the agency of the citizen, the agency of the voter is a very critical aspect of democracy, and that agency depends on the nature of information that people have. And we must be intentional. We shouldn't be presumptuous about the good intentions of those people who are using that space for whatever agenda. It can easily be hijacked. And so we need to balance against the encroachment of those powerful people in politics, but also against other equally nefarious actors who may want to use that space for their own wicked agendas. Thank you so much for your kind attention.